Welcome back to MACNA 2021 Online, Supporting an Equitable Trade. Our next speaker, I think, is well known to everyone. She's been at MACNA 2019, as well as Mini MACNA in 2020, is Dr. Judy St. Judy is the president of Rising Tide Conservation as well as an adjunct professor at Cornell University. She has a varied past with amazing animals for decades of years, Judy. Oh, you do so much. And she's here today to talk to us about the challenges and opportunities in sustainable aquaculture, a rising tide perspective. Judy, welcome to MACNA 2021, Supporting an Equitable Trade, and thank you for being a speaker.
Oh, thank you a ton, Kevin. I'm psyched to be here. As always, I think MACNA is an amazing event. Virtual has been hard on everybody, but I like that you're still making it happen. And I really look forward to 2022 when we can all hang out together and not only swap stories in person, but maybe have a non-virtual beverage. Huh?
Yes.
All right. Well, folks, as I said to Kevin, thank you so much for having me here. I really want to talk about what's happening with Rising Tide Conservation, but I'd sort of like to start things out right here with a little story about my mom. Now, I'm kind of older than many of you here, so I will tell you my mom's not with us anymore, so I can tell these stories now. But I want to tell you what it was like helping my mom with her yard. If you mowed the lawn, she'd say, thanks for mowing the lawn. Did you trim the bushes? And no matter what a great job you did on the lawn, you still hadn't trimmed the bushes. So if it was a hot day, but you really wanted mom to be happy, you'd trim the bushes and then say, hey, mom, I mowed the lawn and I trimmed the bushes. And she'd go, oh, that's really great. Thanks so much for your help. Did you sweep the sidewalk? I didn't sweep the sidewalk. So then you had mowed the lawn, you'd trim the bushes, you swept the sidewalk, you'd make sure everything looks fabulous. And you'd say, hey, mom, I did everything. And then just, to make you extra happy, I weeded the flower beds. So everything's done. And the fact is, you felt you'd done everything. So her yard looked awesome. And then she'd come back and say, well, what about this? And the reason I tell you this story of my picky and somewhat annoying mom, who we love dearly, is that she always wanted us to do things one step better. And she wanted us not to look at everything we'd done, but to look at everything more we could do, because the fact was, it was always sort of a moving target. And as you figured out, you could never hit the target with my mom. Well, when it comes to Rising Tide Conservation, maybe I'm a little bit like my mom. When we started things out, we said, okay, what's this problem that we want to address with Rising Tide? And the aquarium hobby and display aquaria are at risk because of changes in things like both domestic and international legislation, changes in transport. We all know with COVID how the world has changed and how reliant we are upon flights, things we didn't think of 5 years ago that now we think of every single day. And let's face it, it comes down to economics. But it's not just sort of one bullet point of problems. We've got sustainable and transparent collection. It's not that some fish can't be collected, but because we have supply chain challenges and increasing costs in these areas, and those same problems that we had earlier in things like transportation, we really have continued problems having good supply for the aquarium industry. Now, there's still strong demand for marine fish in both the hobby and display industry, but what we're starting to see is a reduction in the species options. So you can have as many clownfish as you want, but when we talk about angels or some of the wrasses, the rules aren't the same. So Rising Tide is all about focused aquaculture and using aquaculture to sort of highlight the industry's commitment to sustainability. I've got this picture down here in the lower right to remind you that the ocean is not a big, empty place. It's a dynamic, living, thriving place. And aquaculture is only part of the industry for both the hobby and display aquaculture worlds. But the fact is, it's part of the equation for sustainability. And so when we talk sustainability, I think we need to think about the role of aquaculture in this industry. Now, what's tough is, and this is sort of like my mom, we're raising a number of different marine species in aquaculture, but current marine aquaculture does not meet either the scope or diversity of demand. So Rising Tide's been around for 12 years now. You'd think we'd have our act together and have things under control, but apparently not. As we are identifying more species and determining how to rear them, what we're finding is we're not producing enough fish, we're not producing enough diversity of fishes, and we're still working on sort of getting the equation together. I'd like to talk about ways to improve our equation today. Let's start with the fact that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the ocean floor. And this is important, not because I don't think the stuff they do in NASA is important, but because we need to know more about the ocean. And because of this, I think that the marine tanks and the marine aquarium hobby and industry are critically important. They're critically important because we need to inspire people to care about this earth. And let's face it, it shouldn't be called the earth, it should be called the ocean, because there's more ocean than earth. When it comes down to it, the reason we need a productive, thriving, and sustainable marine hobby industry is because we need to care and we need to know about the ocean. So when folks say, is sustainability important? My God, yes. It's important in our tanks and it's important in the ocean environment. And I think raising fish in aquaculture is part of sustainability, but it's just part. So let's spend a few minutes and sort of look back and say, okay, what has Rising Tide done and where are we going? It's sort of like, okay, let's take a look at the lawn we mowed. So this slide is an old slide back from 2010. So it's 11 years old. And when we first started thinking about alternate supply aquaculture, or let's face it, Rising Tide, we wanted to advance ornamental aquaculture by providing alternatives to collecting fish from reefs. We wanted to sort of address things like challenges with supply chain management, limited distribution, destructive collection, poor captive specimens. We wanted to increase options for production. Well, I keep this slide in my talks because I really like folks to remember, hey, these were the primary things we started addressing when we started with Rising Tide. But what's important is, as we've moved forward, we've had what I call some good and some bad. Now, on sort of the good side of the equation, there has been fantastic, and thank you all, for terrific aquarist interest, ability, and knowledge. And this is not only the hobbyists, but also folks in the professional display aquarium industry. When you go to your local zoo or aquarium and you see fish in tanks there, those folks taking care of those fish really want to be part of conservation and sustainability. They really want to contribute. There has been good protection for collections. In other words, people don't want to get rid of aquarium fish. Aquarium fish are good, we know it, and they tell an important story both to aquarists and to folks who see these fish in display aquaria. They really are important for promoting conservation. So in the grand scheme of things, having marine fish in tanks helps to remind people about the importance and the value of the ocean. Now, it's been easy to collect eggs from existing exhibits, right? So raising marine fish takes a lot of time and space. And in display aquaria, we have both space and fish that have been there for a long time. So if we can collect eggs from these aquaria, we sort of jumpstart the production of fish eggs and larvae for rearing. So current programs are designed that really help to make this work. So we have a lot of good things sort of in place, sort of as Rising Tide integrates with both local hobby producers as well as local display aquaria. But we still have sort of the standard challenges that producing marine fish requires a lot of time, money, staff, and space. This isn't easy, and it isn't little. It's a big program. It requires not just places for the fish we're raising, but microalgae and feed cultures, as well as the fish culture that we're working on. It's a slow process. When you hear the folks at OI talk about how long it took to figure out how to raise yellow tangs, you know that this isn't sort of a simple, whoop, take some eggs, feed some algae, move on kind of solution. But what we do know is, as we advance things in our understanding and ability to raise marine fish, in order to be sustainable, the whole program must be profitable. So down here in the corner, I've got a fish you can get from Pro Aquatics. What's important is lots of small fish, clowns, dottybacks, some blennies. Those species of fish are commonly available commercially through aquaculture, but we need to expand the fish species. We need to focus on these demersal species that are hard to raise and really sort of up the game in what we're doing. In other words, we have to go from mowing the lawn to trimming the bushes, and we have to do it in spite of the good and the bad that we're presented with. Now, many display aquaria have these things called MoLaR systems, and a MoLaR system has nothing to do with your teeth and everything to do with collecting eggs from your display aquarium and raising those eggs in these modular larval rearing systems that are used for raising up fish from eggs. And what you see here on the right is all the different marine species and freshwater species that have been raised in public aquaria using MoLaR systems. Now, there were some terrific grant programs, and there are currently 18 institutions that have these systems. They've raised over 4,000 individuals, which, let's face it, is a bunch, but in the world of fish, not so many. But the MoLaR systems are still in place. So if you are listening to me and you're an aquarist at a public display aquarium and you're thinking, hey, what could I do? Think about using these systems to help raise some fish. What's important, though, is when we look at these species of fish that are being raised, they tend to be the ones that are a little bit easier to raise. I'm okay with that. In the world of sustainability, you need to start somewhere. So start with fish that are easier to raise, and then come work for one of the facilities that are doing some of the tough ones. Now, when we go back, let's say we're getting out the lawnmower, Rising Tide started back in 2009. So now we've got 12 years under our belt. And really what Rising Tide does is we don't raise fish, we raise opportunities. We raise money, and we give that money to researchers who figure out how to raise fish. And then we help those researchers to connect with people who wholesale fish or retail fish. And we try to close the cycle to make things sustainable and doable. Hopefully, we're pretty integrated into both the hobby industry and into the display industry. And we can make a difference in reefs because we do things this way. But here's what's important. I don't raise fish. I raise money. Let me introduce you to some researchers who raise fish. Over the years, we've had a number of facilities that have been involved. Here on the right is Eric Cassiano at the University of Florida. And in Florida, both the Tropical Aquaculture Lab and the Indian River Research Center have been important in experimentation and raising fish for us. Hawaii Pacific University and the Oceanic Institute have done fabulous work, specifically when we talk about that darn yellow tang. They did work long before Rising Tide came along, and to be honest, I suspect they will be perfecting yellow tangs long after Rising Tide is shuttered and gone. But what's important is their commitment and their focus on that species in particular has been critical in advancing what we can do with tangs and yellow tangs in particular. I'm very excited, and over the next few months, we'll be talking more about some work we'll be doing with the University of Hawaii. As lots of folks know, Hawaii is sort of a hotbed when it comes to marine fish collection. And if the industry can show how committed we are to sustainable aquaculture, perhaps the world can start to understand that we care about these fish, and that when we say we have a sustainable program for them, it doesn't just have to be aquaculture when we're looking at the fishes of Hawaii. We've also worked with folks at a number of small universities and colleges, but what's important is we're always looking to expand our base of facilities with researchers looking for fish. So if you're thinking, hey, I go to a small college and we raise bait fish, what do we have to do to be part of Rising Tide? Check in with us. We're interested in working with folks. We're not interested in setting up an entire research program at your facility, but if you have one and you'd like to integrate what we're doing at Rising Tide, we'd sure as heck like to talk about things with you. Now, when I say we're not interested in setting up your facility, you can see you need more than a fish tank to sort of make things happen. At University of Florida, here we have 440-liter tanks and a recirculating larval system. And we've got blue tank broodstock, as well as smaller tanks, the 104-liter tanks, where some blue tanks are also held. What's important is when I say that we need space for these fish, I mean it. The 104-liter tanks are small tanks, and they're sort of an investigation to see how small can you go. But the fact is we need broodstock that are happy and producing eggs so we can raise those eggs to create larvae and then fish. Pacific blue tang larvae get big quick, and we need to make sure that we're not just monitoring what they're eating, but make sure they're not poking and prodding and chewing on each other as they get bigger. It's important because when you're raising fish, it's not hard to start with thousands, but you want to end up with more than 10 when you're done. And again, this is just because I absolutely love to see the progression of the Pacific blue tang. The blue pigment in these guys, as they're sort of getting older and settling, we can see it by 66 days post-hatch. We know that different elements of development really impact how these larvae development. We've got complete blue coloration here at 77 days, and then the tail has started to turn yellow in these fish at 94 days post-hatch. Milletseed butterflies, I simply put these guys in here to remind you that there's lots of different species we've worked with Rising Tide, but we need to get them now from research to commercial production. And although these fishes are little when they start out, they're big when they get to broodstock size. We need to make sure that folks are committed to helping us with broodstock development and conditioning. In the grand scheme of how can I help Rising Tide, let's talk about raising some adult fish and conditioning them so they're ready to produce eggs. Certainly, eggs are critical for sustainable culture of marine fish. And that being the case, we need more fish like this big girl to get more little kids like this guy over here. Now, a number of years ago, Brittain did a project, a fabulous project, where she bred the purple-masked angelfish and raised up its larvae. This is a female here, raised up its larvae to produce fish. Karen is someone I'm always delighted to have said was funded for a period of time by Rising Tide. And the reason, I'm happy to say it, is she continues to work with different fish species and to rear up fish. In the grand scheme of what kind of researchers do I want to fund for Rising Tide, Brittain is high on the list. She's high on the list because she looks at fish. She says, what fish will lay eggs for me? And she says, how can I take that fish and make fabulous babies? Before Karen started working with these purple-masked angelfish, people really didn't think they were terrific in their tanks. Now I know people clamor for them simply because Karen's been able to raise this species. And when they are captive adapted, they're fantastic in aquariums for display. The most recent success of Rising Tide conservation, I think oh, so many folks are tired of hearing about copper-banded butterflies, but we're not done talking about them yet, because certainly here's a species of fish that the folks at the University of Florida tried for a couple of years to get right. And when they did, they've done it in a big way. And as I speak right now, we have a number of these fish that we're trying to figure out what's the best way to get this great fish into people's home tanks and display aquaria, because they've done well being raised. And they didn't raise one or two of them. They've raised tens to hundreds. And that's what we want to see. But we want to see it not just in research settings. We need to see it go from research to commercial production. Come on, aren't these fish beautiful? Let's talk a little bit about commercial production. We have industry partners, and those include everyone from display aquaria. So, you know, the Shed Aquarium, the aquariums at SeaWorld and Busch Gardens, but we also have retailers, wholesalers, producers, and aquaculture businesses. So like the folks at Biota, these folks have expanded tremendously in the past few years. And what they're doing is really looking to make aquaculture a big part of what's happening with fish production. Now, there are many other businesses. Here we've got a fish at Pro Aquatics. Pro Aquatics has been fantastic at adapting the technologies that are developed in the University of Florida facilities and saying, hey, we can raise that fish. I put these two industry partners in as examples simply to show that we need more. So if you want to make a difference in the world, think about contributing to sustainability of marine ornamental fish. I'd like to see tremendous competition in the world of home aquaria and pet fish, because there are so many businesses set up and starting to thrive producing aquacultured fish. I realize we're not going to have 50 businesses like this in the next couple of years, but if we could have 5, that would be something really awesome. Now, there are a number of different businesses, and please, if I didn't mention yours by name, forgive me, because certainly one of the things we know is lots of folks will rear aquacultured fish and lots of folks will sell aquacultured fish. Think about this as part of sustainability. This is from Algae Barn's online fish inventory. And I put it in here simply because they have Biota aquaculture blue tang and yellow tang. And then I put in these little ovals here. Do you know why I put the ovals? Because they cover up out of stock. I'd like to see this page where everything looks like these Cuban basslets and the radial filefish and the platinum storm clownfish. See how these are all in stock? I'd like to see these seahorses and tangs in stock regularly as well. So please, when you're thinking, what can I do to help sustainability? Think about supporting these aquacultured fish species. We talked a little bit about Karen Brittain. I'd also like to just put in a plug for Dr. Matt Wittenrich. Matt was one of the first rising tide biologists. His PhD work was done with marine fish. And in 2017, he opened what I call a boutique shop called Poma Labs. What I really like is Matt went from I can raise fish on a research basis to I can raise fish. Now I realize everyone can't do this, but think about it. He said, I'm committed to this. I want to do this, and it's the right thing to do. Matt's taken sustainability from his garage to the industry, and I think we're all pretty pleased to see it. And I know that I'm over the moon happy to see it and really proud of the work that he's done in the grand scheme of, what could I do? Think about, this is what Matt's done just because of his commitment to sustainable aquaculture and the impact it can have on the marine industry. Now, for rising tide, we always say, well, how do you choose these species? And I think people that have heard me talk have heard that I've got this big focus on, hey, we should do more of these wrasses, right? I really like these wrasses. And I like them because there are many of them in the industry, and there are a lot of them that really could use some sort of focus on marine aquaculture. But what's important, to be perfectly honest, is lots of time, these fishes of opportunities tend to come up and bite us in the nose. So while I've got this Cuban hogfish here, and I can take that species from eggs all the way to adulthood, it doesn't mean that I'm focusing specifically on that because it's such a terrific fish. When it's a fish whose opportunity comes along, those are good fish to focus on. And in the grand scheme of demersal spawners that we really want to make a difference with, it's nice that specifically the folks at the University of Florida could help make Cuban hogfish or the spot fin hogfish a reality in aquaculture. Now, lots of species have been focused on. I've got these green chromis over here on the right. But if you look, this is a progression that was done by Matt Wittenrich and Eric Cassiano. My God, if you're not tired of seeing pictures I've got from when Matt and Eric worked for Rising Tide, you don't hear me talk enough. These species that are here in this old slide show, my God, we've sort of worked on, reared, or promoted a ton of different species. Now, not all of them have sort of worked out. And you can see the green chromis progression, but I sure as heck don't have progressions of all of the cleaner wrasses or the cory wrasses or a lot of these butterfly fish. The fact is, we've had great success, but if you can't get all of these fish commercially right now, somewhere we dropped the ball. We didn't trim the bushes, we just mowed the lawn. So we need to sort of move things forward a little bit. Rising Tide is getting back into an old success story we used to have, which is collecting eggs from large aquaria. Now, in these programs, we use large egg collectors that generally just have upwelling of air that helps the eggs to be collected. And then we sort of use settlement to separate the viable from non-viable eggs. The eggs are then processed, packaged, shipped to researchers. And the focus is in saying, hey, how can we raise these fish that really need a large tank to sort of do well? Some work was done a few years ago with Hawaiian endemics, and it was fantastically successful. We raised everything from yellow tangs to Klein's butterfly fish, to some cleaner wrasses, to some long-nosed butterflies. My God, this is just collecting eggs from a large display aquarium. What's important is there are many different ways to sustainably raise marine fish. And if the answer is we need to be clever about how we get those eggs and how we condition the broodstock, please help us to do so. I'm here today because I'd like your help sort of trimming the bushes and sweeping the sidewalk. I'd like to go from, hey, we have a little project that does research to, hey, these fish are commercially available from lots of different producers. Now, the display aquaria industry has done a great thing sort of in doing what they do best. These are pictures from SeaWorld Orlando and Busch Gardens in Tampa. And they talk about how in those public display areas, there's been great signage. So the folks in SeaWorld of Orlando, and those of you who've known Rising Tide for a long time, know that even before yellow tang had been successfully reared, they were talking about yellow tang in Orlando. Well, now that it's happened, thank God it happened, because there was a whole lot of signage that needed to be adjusted if we didn't sort of move forward and get those yellow tangs all the way to through larval rearing. But what's important is if you go to your local aquarium and they don't have good signage or ways to educate folks about sustainability and marine health and coral reef concerns, let me know. Let me know, because we'd like to make sure that every display aquaria in America is talking about sustainability in the marine aquarium hobby and the marine aquarium display industries. It's important. You can make it happen, and I'm willing to help those folks make it happen. So let's get her done. And that comes back down to who's Rising Tide. Rising Tide is sort of stakeholder driven. So we have this annual meeting. This is from a few years ago. It's often held in conjunction with other meetings. I like it when we hold it in nice tropical places, but it has been held as a standalone meeting a few times. And it was virtual in 2020, and it's going to be virtual in 2021. What's important about that is you can become invested as a stakeholder for Rising Tide. We used to really focus on who's producing these fishes, who are students that are up and coming on things, who are display aquaria, who's holding broodstock, who are wholesalers and retailers. These days, we're very interested in folks who say, I want to be part of this program. What can I do to help make things happen? We've got a list of ways to help make things happen. It's a stakeholder-driven program, and you can be one of the stakeholders easily. Now, we always sort of have a forward focus, right? We can't just mow the lawn and trim the bushes. We have to edge the sidewalk as well. And we have to look at not what we have done, but what we are doing. So a few years ago, we came up with this 5-year focus. We had 3 teams, and they sort of looked at conservation concerns, the hobby industry, volume, the display industry needs. And they said, well, these are kind of the fishes that we think are important. Oh my gosh, look how many fishes there are. What I can tell you is we're trying to address these species, but not forgetting about the other species that are important. Many years ago, we came up with the term fishes of opportunity. And certainly we focus on the fishes of import and the fishes of opportunity, but we want to do it not just with research, but with going from research to commercial production. So I'm going to stop saying it, I promise. But I want to make sure everyone listening to this thinks, okay, what can I do to promote commercial production of any of these fish species that it looks like are important for sustainability? Now, one thing we've had to do with Rising Tide is come up with sort of creative funding. Unfortunately, there's a lot of research that is behind the rearing of these fish species, and feeding researchers isn't cheap. As you've already seen, the holding for the fishes is large and expensive. And so we've had terrific fundraising programs like Discovery Cove down in Orlando donates 5% of all Sea Venture proceeds to Rising Tide. Sea Venture is what these folks are doing. They have these diving helmets on, and they're going in the water amidst fishes to sort of experience what it's like in a marine environment. Specifically, SeaWorld is funding a 2021 grad student that we'll be talking about on Rising Tide social media in the next few weeks. But that student's whole cost of existence and research is paid for by this Discovery Cove donation. The folks at Petco have been longtime supporters of Rising Tide conservation. And in 2021, they are funding completely a grant we're having at the University of Hawaii for both students and biologists to sort of expand Rising Tide into the amazing work that's happening at the University of Hawaii. Now, where's your name? Think about it. Because if you think, hey, my club or my friends or I can do cool funding things that would help Rising Tide, I'm interested in hearing from you. The stakeholder model has been super valuable to Rising Tide because it gives us a broader base. It really helps for integration on multiple fronts with different facilities and students, and it helps to get different partners involved in Rising Tide conservation. I think what's important is people need to remember that now that we've had some successes, we need to go from those successes, and we're interested in doing it by broadening our base. Now, we've got some great aquaculture solutions. We have fishes that are produced in aquaculture that are healthy, that are adapted to captivity, so they eat well in commercial diets. These fish species can be right-sized so that if I am raising a fish species like these golden trevallies that should be in display aquaria, that's where they're going. We want to make sure that aquaculture production is meeting demands of both the hobby and display industries, again, with the right fish and the right amounts. So it's not an easy equation to know what fish to produce and how many fish to produce and when to produce them and things like that. So the challenges remain. But when we come to sustainability, one thing is clear. Aquaculture alone is not the only answer. Aquaculture is difficult. We need more people with experience and intelligence as it relates to aquaculture. We need probably 3 to 5 new entrants into this industry per year minimum in the US. We also need folks with big visions or commitments to philanthropy to say, hey, I'm willing to invest to make something awesome happen now because I think this is important and I want it to be sustainable in the future. If you're one of those people, check in with me. We need businesses, both large and small, to invest in broodstock holding, in larval feeding, in new ways of producing microalgae that meet the needs of these fish as they're being raised. And we need better integration with the display industry, with hobbyists, and with researchers, really for things like broodstock conditioning and growing, as well as egg collections. I've added to my mother's lawn care list. You got to do the lawn, you got to do the bushes, you got to sweep the sidewalk, you got to weed the garden. We also need folks like economists and accountants to become involved in Rising Tide, because we need to make sure that what we produce is sustainable economically and makes sense in a business world. I hate to say it, but conservation often has a foundation in business. And if we ignore that fact, it's going to be to all of our detriment. I know I sometimes ramble on and on when I'm talking about Rising Tide, and it's because there's a whole lot of moving pieces. But the fact is, this is the time. If you've ever said, hey, I'd like to be involved in Rising Tide, this is your opportunity because we need you. If you're interested in connecting and getting in touch, we've got the question and answer session later today. I'll be there and I'd be delighted to talk to you and hear what's going on. We've got some happy hours, I think, at MACNA this year, and I'd be delighted to meet you if we can work something out there with a beverage. And lastly, Huntley and Amanda, the social media goddesses of Rising Tide, do a lot to sort of get the word out as to what we're doing and what's happening with the program. So if you're interested in learning more or seeing what's going on, these are all the different ways that you can sort of be part of those in the know with Rising Tide. If you want to specifically reach me, and note, sometimes I'm good, sometimes I'm bad with communication. My email is down here and I'd be happy to talk to you and to get you involved in what's happening with Rising Tide. The fact is, I couldn't be more committed to sustainability in the marine aquarium industry. But I'm committed because I love the ocean and I love coral reefs, and because I believe people that are part of the aquarium world love the ocean and reefs and fishes as well. And those are the kind of people I like to hang out with. So first and foremost, most importantly, I want to say thank you to everyone who has supported Rising Tide, who has been committed to making sure we feel like we're doing the right thing. And for those who've said, look, yeah, I really think that this is part of our long-term sustainability solution. I appreciate it. I want to hear your new thoughts, and I want to know what you think is going right and wrong. So you can be just like my mom. Let me know if I screwed up on mowing the lawn. But if the next step is to trim the bushes, you just got to tell us so we know where to go and we can make it happen. And I think working together, we can all make this happen. Kevin, as always, thank you for letting me talk to the folks here at MACNA. I love doing it. Maybe we should do it 2-3 times a year. I don't know.
Sounds good to me, Judy.
But I appreciate it. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Judy. And thank you to your mother. It was a great story, Judy. I just want to remind everyone they can go to macna.org/questions. If you have a question for Judy, you can type it in there. And like Judy said, she'll be available at the end of the day. I got my moving background on behind me. Oh, yeah. And Judy, nice. I hope you can come to MACNA 2022, and I hope we can have Rising Tide there. You guys might have seen Judy and the Rising Tide social media team at a previous MACNA, and I hope to have them there at Milwaukee, Wisconsin as well. Judy, a quick question. Can you remind us of the URL again for Rising Tide?
It is risingtideconservation.org.
And they can get a hold of you through your email, which is judy.st or st.ledger and at gmail.com, right?
That's exactly right. And truth be told, Huntley and Amanda are really the people who you communicate with most.
Yes.
But I do get around to stuff, I promise.
Okay. And they can you can get a hold of them through the social media, or I believe there's probably contact information there on Rising Tide's website. And
That's
you can
correct.
find out more about Rising Tide right there on their website. Thank you very much, Judy. And I hope that everyone goes to macna.org/questions and asks questions for Judy. Thank you, Judy.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone.